Imagine you're a factory worker in Moscow. It's January 2026. The television in your apartment blares news of geopolitical victories. But your reality is shrinking. Your employer just announced a 4-day workweek, a quiet policy they call tactical poverty. On the world stage, analysts praise Russia's resilience, pointing to an economy that hasn't collapsed despite nearly 24,000 sanctions. But you feel the weakness. The IMF agrees, slashing the growth forecast to a dismal 0.8%. So which is it? Is Russia strong, or is it slowly bleeding out? The answer isn't in today's headlines or the current war. It's buried in a decision made decades ago, a hidden flaw that created an economic curse. And it has nothing to do with Italy, but everything to do with Russia's future. To understand Russia's economic trap, you have to go back to the beginning. Rewind past the sanctions, past the conflicts, to January 1992. The Soviet flag had just come down. For a moment, anything seemed possible. The West saw a new market of millions, and Russians hoped for a new era of prosperity. But what they got was a system built on a fatal flaw, a kind of economic original sin. It was called privatization, but a better name would be the Great Handoff. Imagine the entire industrial might of a superpower, everything from oil fields to tractor factories, suddenly up for grabs. Instead of creating a competitive market, this fire sale created a new class of oligarchs overnight. A handful of insiders with the right connections scooped up the crown jewels of the Soviet Empire for pennies on the dollar. The foundation of Russia's new economy wasn't built on innovation or fair competition. It was built on a rigged game. The chaos of that decade is hard to overstate. By 1999, the government's debt had exploded to a staggering 92.1% of its entire economic output. Think about that. For every dollar the country produced, it owed nearly a full dollar in debt. It was a nation on the verge of bankruptcy, its new wealth concentrated in the hands of a few while millions were plunged into poverty. For a brief period in the 2000s, soaring oil prices papered over these cracks. The European Union even formally recognized Russia as a market economy in May 2002. It looked like progress, but the underlying structure never changed. The state and the oligarchs had merged, creating a system that didn't need to invent or build. It only needed to drill. This dependency created a gilded cage, shining on the outside but trapping the country in a cycle of resource extraction. So the pressures you see today, the sanctions and the isolation, they didn't create a new problem. They simply ripped the gold plating off that cage, exposing the rot that's been festering for over 30 years. And at the heart of that rot is one single intoxicating substance. This isn't just a story about a distant country. It's a warning about a specific kind of economic sickness. An economy can appear strong while it's actually burning itself out. Since last year, Russia's economy has been officially overheating. It's running hot not on innovation or consumer demand, but on military production. This unsustainable boom forces businesses into what Russians themselves are now calling tactical poverty, the quiet belt-tightening that shrinks your world one frozen salary at a time. While the Kremlin can boast that its government debt averaged under 20% of GDP for decades, that stability on paper means nothing when your own future is shrinking. This kind of managed decay doesn't stay behind borders. It creates global instability that ripples through energy markets and supply chains, directly impacting your investments, your pension, and the security that underpins your financial life. It's a slow-motion crisis with global consequences. How did a nation with such immense natural wealth get locked into a system that punishes its own people to survive? What was the original mistake? The 1990s weren't a transition. They were a street fight for the soul of a nation. While the world celebrated the end of the Cold War, a handful of insiders ran a process I call the Kleptocrat's auction. This wasn't a sale. It was a carve-up. Russia's crown jewels, its sprawling factories, its deep mines, its vast oil fields, were sold off for pennies on the dollar to the politically connected. A new class of oligarchs was born overnight. These weren't entrepreneurs in the Western sense. They were predators who had mastered the new system's one unwritten rule. Proximity to power is the only asset that matters. For ordinary Russians, this new freedom was a brutal shock. Imagine your life savings turning to dust. For years, inflation averaged a staggering 98.95%. This wasn't building a market. It was a hostile takeover of an entire country, transferring the wealth of millions into the pockets of a few dozen. This was the original sin of the modern Russian economy. It established a permanent divide, a society of billionaires and bystanders. By the turn of the century, the open chaos subsided into a new, brittle order. On paper, the state looked responsible. For over 2 decades, government debt remained surprisingly low, averaging just under 20% of GDP. It created a facade of fiscal health, a veneer of control painted over a cracked and hollow core. But this stability was an illusion. The system was never built to innovate or compete. It was built to extract. And buried deep inside its very DNA was a fatal dependency, a hidden mechanism that guaranteed stagnation. So how does a modern economy hollow itself out from the inside? It's not a sudden collapse. It's a deliberate, predictable process, a machine designed for a single purpose. I call it the Kremlin's flywheel. Its only function is to convert the nation's long-term potential into immediate geopolitical power, no matter the cost. Imagine you're redlining a car engine. You floor the accelerator, ignoring the screaming gauges and the flashing warning lights on the dashboard. For a few moments, you get incredible speed. But you're also melting the pistons and warping the engine block. The damage is permanent, and a breakdown isn't a possibility, it's a certainty. The flywheel works in 3 distinct phases. First, the state injects massive, artificial demand into one single sector, defense. The government floods military factories with contracts, creating a surge of war-driven growth. This is the foot slamming down on the accelerator. Second, this intense focus pulls talent, capital, and resources from every other part of the economy. Consumer goods, technology, housing, services, they all begin to starve. This is why Russian businesses are now adopting what they call tactical poverty, cutting back just to survive. The engine is overheating, but only in one spot. The rest of the machine is freezing over. Third, the nearly 24,000 sanctions act like a sealed engine bay. There is no release valve. Russia can't easily import the parts, the software, or the expertise it needs to relieve the pressure or repair the damage. The economy isn't just running hot. It's cooking itself from within. And here's the most deceptive part. On the surface, the numbers can look stable. Government debt is a mere 20.4% of GDP, a figure most Western finance ministers would dream of. But this isn't a debt crisis. The flywheel is powered by cannibalizing the country's future, not by borrowing from it. But how much energy is this machine really burning? And how long can it possibly last before it seizes completely? To find out, we have to look past the headlines and do the math. Let's travel to Togliari, a city built around the colossal Avtovaz plant, the maker of the iconic Lada. For generations, your life here was measured by the factory whistle. And for a moment, in 2025, things felt good. The national economy was officially overheating. It's a strange term. Think of it like flooring the gas on a car that's stuck in the mud. The engine screams, the RPMs redline, and you're burning fuel at an incredible rate. But you're not actually going anywhere. For the workers, this meant mandatory overtime. It meant bonuses for hitting production targets that seemed to come out of nowhere. The money was flowing, but it was an illusion. A dangerous one, because while the numbers on your payslip went up, their power went down. This is a quiet theft I call the value bleed. It's when your money loses its meaning. Remember the shock of 2022? The government admitted to an average inflation rate of 13.75%. That's not a statistic, it's a threat. It means that the 100 rubles you saved in January were only worth 86 by December. It's a silent tax on your future, collected every single day. Your hard-earned cash was leaking value, drip by drip, right out of your wallet. Then the machine started to stutter. The constant hum of the assembly line grew quiet. Why? The sanctions. Not the big, headline-grabbing ones, but the thousands of tiny cuts. A specific valve from Italy. A particular sensor from South Korea. An electronic control unit from Taiwan. Each one a missing piece of the puzzle. The factory had stockpiles, but they couldn't last forever. First, the overtime vanished. Then came the memo about production optimization. Finally, the plant manager gathered the shift leaders. The factory was moving to a 4-day workweek, indefinitely. For a family in Togliari, this wasn't a talking point. It was a crisis, a 20% cut in your household income overnight. Do you pay for your daughter's music lessons, or do you fix the roof before winter? Do you buy the medicine your parents need, or do you keep the car running? These weren't abstract economic choices. They were impossible dilemmas, forced upon millions of ordinary people by decisions made 1,000 kilometers away in the Kremlin. The factory, their fortress of stability, had become a trap. But this was just the beginning. So how does this machine actually work? On the surface, the logic seems sound, but when you look closer, you see the fatal flaw in the design. It's a process I call the substitution engine, and it operates in 3 distinct phases. First comes the external shock. Imagine nearly 24,000 economic sanctions landing at once. It's like a dam breaking. Foreign technology, components, and investment capital don't just slow down, they vanish. Suddenly, the supply chains that took decades to build are severed. The parts for your car, the software for your phone, the turbines for your power plant, they're gone. This creates a vacuum, a massive, gaping hole in the industrial base. This is where the engine kicks into gear. The state issues a simple command: replace everything, build it yourself. This is the substitution mandate. From the outside, it looks like a wartime miracle. Factories that were idle are now humming. New production lines are announced. The headlines scream about Russian ingenuity and resilience. And for a moment, you might even believe it. You see people working. You see things being made. This is the great deception. This is why almost everyone misses the rot setting in. Because the third step is the efficiency collapse. Think of your economy as a high-performance engine, tuned over years to run on premium fuel. The substitution engine forces it to run on crude, unrefined oil. The engine still turns over, it makes noise. It burns fuel, a lot of it. But it's shaking itself to pieces. The new, domestically produced parts cost more, break down faster, and are less effective. A modern tractor is replaced with a design from the 1970s. A sophisticated medical scanner is swapped for a less precise, more power-hungry alternative. The economy is now overheating, as experts call it. It's burning more energy just to produce less value. This is the illusion. The state can point to an inflation rate that dropped from 6.60% to 5.60% in late 2025 and claim stability. They can boast about a low government debt-to-GDP ratio, which has averaged just 19.89% for a quarter century. But these numbers hide a terrifying truth. They are measuring the heat, not the horsepower. They are tracking the smoke, not the distance traveled. The system is consuming itself, mistaking the fever for growth. This isn't just a metaphor. The decay is quantifiable. You can track the drop in efficiency, the rise in cost, and the decline in output per worker. And when you put those variables into an equation, you can pinpoint the exact moment the system becomes unsustainable. The math reveals a story the official reports are designed to conceal. The problem in Togliari wasn't an isolated event. It was the first tremor of an earthquake. Because what happens to a car factory is just a symptom. The real disease is in the country's bloodstream, and it's spreading. To see the next stage, you have to leave the factory floor and travel to the financial centers of Moscow. Here, the scale of the problem isn't measured in assembly lines, but in entire economic sectors. While the world's financial leaders met in Davos in January, Russia was conspicuously absent. They were cut off. The Kremlin points to its low government debt, just over 20% of GDP, as a sign of fiscal health. A fortress economy, they call it. But this isn't strength. It's a symptom of isolation. I call it the fortress fallacy. A country with almost no debt isn't necessarily responsible. It might just be a country nobody is willing to lend to. It's a sign of a capital drought. And when capital dries up, everything withers. This is the cascade. It starts with a foreign microchip for a car's anti-lock brakes. Then it's a turbine for a power plant. Then it's the software that runs a nation's banking system. Each time a foreign component is blocked, the same flawed substitution process kicks in. The result is a slow, grinding decay across the entire technological stack of the nation. You can't build a 21st century economy with 20th century tools. The proof is in the numbers. The International Monetary Fund just slashed Russia's growth forecast for this year to a pathetic 0.8%. That's not growth. That's a flat line. They had a chance to build a real, diversified economy. They saw what happened when the Soviet system collapsed under its own weight. But the lesson was never learned. Instead of building bridges to the world, they built walls. And now, they're trapped inside. And here's where it gets personal. The official numbers look manageable, but they hide a devastating truth. The real damage isn't found in a government report, it's in the friction of every single transaction. Think about the nearly 24,000 sanctions imposed on Russia. This isn't a wall, it's a swamp. Every company trying to import a machine part or a piece of software now has to navigate it. This creates a hidden mechanism I call the sanction siphon. Let's do the math. Imagine a critical ball bearing for a factory costs $100 from Germany. Simple, direct. Now that route is closed. The Russian company has to buy it through a shell company in a neutral country. That company buys it from another intermediary. Each step adds a fee, a risk premium. That $100 part now costs $150. That extra $50? It's not an investment. It's not a tax that builds roads. It's pure loss. It's the cost of the siphon. Now multiply that by millions of transactions every single day. It's a quiet, relentless bleed of national wealth happening in the shadows of the global supply chain. This invisible tax makes everything more expensive and less efficient. It strangles innovation before it can even begin. Why build a new factory when the cost of every screw, every circuit board, is artificially inflated by 30, 40, or 50%? You don't. You just try to survive. This constant grinding pressure creates a financial black hole at the center of the economy. It forces the Kremlin into a corner with a shrinking list of options. Each choice leads to a different future, a different version of Russia. So what are the paths from here? Now at this point, a skeptic might raise a valid objection. They'll point to the screen and say, look, the economy hasn't collapsed. And they're not wrong. They'll show you Russia's government debt, incredibly low at just over 20% of GDP. How can a country be in trouble with books that clean? They'll argue that Russia has weathered an unprecedented storm of nearly 24,000 sanctions and is still standing. It's a powerful argument. On paper, the fortress looks secure. But this is a classic case of what I call the balance sheet mirage. It's focusing on one healthy-looking number while the patient is bleeding out internally. It's like admiring the pristine paint job on a car with a seized engine. While Moscow's public debt looks manageable, organizations like the International Monetary Fund see the truth. They've slashed Russia's growth forecast for this year down to a negligible 0.8%. That's not growth, it's stagnation. This is the reality behind the numbers, a world where Russian businesses are now forced into what they call tactical poverty just to stay afloat. And to be clear, the resilience is real. The Kremlin has proven masterful at crisis management, at keeping the lights on. But this isn't a story of economic strength. It's a story of economic triage. It is the brutal art of choosing what part of the body to sacrifice to keep the heart beating. Those 4-day work weeks and frozen wages aren't signs of a robust economy. They are the price of survival, a bill that will eventually come due. The goal was never to thrive. It was merely to endure. So the entire debate over whether the system is resilient or fragile misses the deeper truth. It was never designed for the prosperity of its people. It was designed for the durability of the state. But even if they were right, so where does this road lead? We can map two distinct futures, two potential realities for the next decade. Scenario A is the conservative case, the most probable path. Let's call it the long stagnation. This isn't a dramatic cinematic collapse. It's a slow, grinding corrosion of potential. The war economy acts like a powerful stimulant, keeping the headline numbers afloat while the civilian economy quietly atrophies. Your quality of life doesn't plummet. It erodes, grain by grain. 1 year, imported medicines become scarce. The next, a new car is an impossible dream. Russia becomes a ghost at global forums like Davos, present on the map but absent from the conversation. The probability? Most analysts put this path at over 70%. It's the baseline forecast for a nation trading its future for the present. Then there is scenario B, the stress test, the low probability, high impact event we can call the fracture point. What happens if a true black swan appears? A sudden, sustained crash in global energy prices, or a cascading failure in a critical technology sector cut off by sanctions. Suddenly, that national debt of over $1.4 trillion, while looking manageable on paper, becomes an anchor pulling the system down. This isn't a gradual decline. It's the moment the social contract snaps. A crisis that spirals from finance to the streets before the Kremlin can react. Of course, many will look at these scenarios and simply say, you underestimate Russian resilience. They'll argue the country has weathered worse storms, that its people are accustomed to hardship, and that the state is more durable than outsiders believe. But let's pause and consider the strongest possible objection. A sharp observer wouldn't argue that everything is fine. They would argue something far more challenging, that this is a new, sustainable normal. They'd say, yes, it's a war economy, but it's a working one. Defense plants are humming, salaries are being paid, and the state is stable. They would argue this isn't a system in crisis. It's a system that has successfully adapted to crisis, a brutal, militarized, but functional equilibrium. And for a moment, that logic seems compelling. The problem is, this isn't equilibrium. It's a managed decline, masquerading as stability. I call it the hollow boom. It's the illusion of economic activity, created by burning through the country's future. While state television might cheer a manufactured crisis in Davos, the story on the ground is that this war-driven growth is already fading. The proof isn't in the official reports. It's in the quiet memos announcing 4-day work weeks. It's in the spread of what Russian businesses themselves now call tactical poverty, a desperate strategy of cutting everything to the bone just to survive another quarter. This isn't resilience, it's a national anesthetic. The unprecedented wave of nearly 24,000 sanctions was never going to be a sudden knockout punch. It was designed as a slow-acting poison, constricting the economy's arteries day by day. And this is where the spreadsheets and official reports fail us. Because the real cost isn't found in a government growth forecast, it's measured in the quiet desperation of a generation stripped of its future. So what's the move? How do you position for a crisis that unfolds not in days, but over years? My personal strategy is to wait. I'm not touching anything right now. Instead, I'm watching for a single, unmistakable signal, a moment I call the survival mandate. It won't be a speech or a headline. It will be the moment the central bank is forced to make a decision that is politically toxic, but economically essential. My trigger is a sudden, aggressive, unscheduled interest rate hike that intentionally puts the economy into a deep freeze just to save the currency from collapse. When I see that signal, and only then, will I consider allocating a tiny fraction of my speculative capital. And I mean tiny. Think of it as a 1% bet, money that I have already written off as a complete loss. Now let me be absolutely clear. This is not investment advice. This is purely a high-risk thought experiment, and you should not attempt to replicate it. Most people who try to catch a falling dagger like this get their hands cut off. This is financial dynamite, and my personal risk tolerance is almost certainly not your own. It's a gambler's bet on a catastrophic outcome reversing itself. But the reason I watch for that one specific trigger is because it marks the point of maximum pain, the moment the system chooses survival over ideology. Because if that signal ever comes, the snapback won't be a gentle recovery. It will be a violent, face-ripping rally that leaves the entire world in shock. So this is the final diagnosis. Not a sudden collapse, but a long, grinding sickness. An economy designed for extraction is now consuming itself. You see the real cost, not on a spreadsheet, but in the quiet desperation of forced 4-day work weeks and shrinking household budgets. This year, while the world's economic leaders gathered in Davos to map out the future, Russia was conspicuously absent. The isolation is no longer just financial, it's absolute. But is this prison escape-proof? Can a nation break such a curse? One country faced this exact spiral and reversed it. Understanding their playbook is critical. To see how they did it, make sure you're subscribed for our next investigation. It's the other half of this story. Because a nation that mortgages its future eventually faces foreclosure.